Gudea. So the emphasis again being that Gudea is creating this bridge between himself and the divine, maintaining contact in a very similar way to what we've seen in votive statues in earlier periods, in the early dynastic period, perhaps even as early with those, those statues that we saw from Ain Ghazal as a first example. One of these examples, actually it's this guy right here, says that it's devoted as a statue to be placed in a funerary chapel. And in this case, we have an example of a statue that may have been not a devotional statue, but may have been an object of worship in itself. A statue that was made for Gudea after he passed away. And you can see in this other cylinder seal a very different kind of presentation scene. This is a cylinder seal from an official, not an NC, being brought forth, right? But in this case, right, look at this. We have a seated individual wearing the same brimmed hat as Gudea himself. Perhaps, again, one of these statues. And there's a theory out there that the way these statues would operate, right, in tandem with the standing and sitting, the sitting would be sort of, at the altar with the standing one facing it, almost creating this sort of connection between the two. But again, unfortunately, we don't have a tremendous amount to elucidate how these guys operated in tandem. But the cylinder seal is interesting for this reason, right? Not wearing, again, the horns of divinity, which we've seen over and over again, but wearing this very different headgear associated with the NC. But we do see a clear connection between the way these objects are created and what they're trying to convey. In these inscriptions, we see statements like, "Statue, your eyes belong to Ningirsu." And of course, right, we have this emphasis on the eyes again, these very large, open eyes. We're told also from texts in the period that those with a broad face and those of wide ear are wise, right? So a wise one who listens, who gives heed to his people, right? Gudea has these very large, wide ears. So there's a connection between the description, the function, and then the depictions of these statues themselves. The hands are quite interesting. Henry Frankfurt writes that these hands are sort of put together in an impossible position. And you can try this, right? If you put your hands together like this, your fingers don't bend back up in this direction, right? So Frankfurt thought that he actually had two right hands. But then, I mean, my sort of thinking about this is like, well, why don't you just do this? And then you're fine. So you will come across this, like Gudea, who has two right hands, or, oh, this is an artistic convention, they don't really know what they're doing. But I don't think it's so much of a problem. You guys can mess around with this as much as you like. In fact, for your second project, your looking project, if you choose to do Gudea, there's a statue of Gudea on the second floor, not here, but over in Barrows Hall, in the department. You'll see there's a life-size statue of Gudea without his head. He's very popular for tourists, not tourists, but visitors to come and stick their head on the statue of Gudea. You can go check it out and see if the hand thing makes sense to you. I personally don't have a problem with it. But one thing we do see is this attention to detail. An attention to detail we haven't seen up until this point. I mean, look at the rendering of the musculature. I mean, Gudea has these large muscular arms, and that's another Sumerian idiom, right? Massive of arm is a way to describe a ruler, and boom, look, we see Gudea certainly is massive of arm. This powerful frame, wonderfully rendered. Even the cuticles of the nails, right? Not just fingernails, but the cuticles are put in place. So there's an ability to execute art during this period, which is quite precise. And what that means is that when we see parts that are left blank, when we see sections that are left to the form of the stone, it's not because they were stuck and they couldn't do it. These are intentional. There's an intentional minimalism and idealism that's taking place in the depiction of the ruler during the time of Gudea. So again, these really lovely lovely pieces. Finally, we also see with these statues some items that go along with them. Two of these seated statues actually have drawing boards on their laps. And again, Gudea, right, is constantly talking about how he's building temples, how he received a dream from Ningirsu to build these temples. And sure enough, on his lap, we see the tools for drafting the plans of temples, right? There's a ruler here. Actually what is either a stylus or probably a plumb bob, which was wrapped with string, and what you would use to actually lay out a temple, to make sure your walls are erected straight. In another seated statue, boom, we have the temple plan itself laid out there before us. I mean, it almost looks like one of these archaeological reconstructions that we find. In fact, we're going to find city maps later on that map out what's known archaeologically. And some of these maps are incredibly accurate. We have no reason to think that during the time of Gudea, that again, this temple with this niched facade, probably was a true temple and emblematic of the temple that the statue was set up in. So you could go up and say, oh, that's exactly where it is. Unfortunately, he didn't put where the statue is supposed to be a little "you are here," but that would have been nice. Anyway, again, we see this emphasis and connection between the king as a pious individual, moving away from Naram-Sin, and a king who shows that piety through the construction of temples and devotion to the gods. Another way of exercising power. And this is just another stele fragment from Gudea too, where you can see he's standing here and holding actually the same implement, what's probably a plumb bob, in his hand. So it's king as measure and ruler. Yeah?
Is the fact that he's now like equal in size with everyone else another factor of like them trying to be more pious? I remember like the king figure was always like
a little bit bigger. If you look, he is still a little bit bigger. Just a little bit though, right? So he's sort of maybe first among equals in that sense. But yeah, certainly there isn't this sense of ostentatious presentation. It's this humble king, but he's like maybe a little overly humble. Look how humble I am 26 times over with all these diorite statues that I'm going to throw in every temple that everyone will still see. So in that sense, it's a very new and different strategy and a different way of exercising power. Also, right, I mean, you can make connections right back to this early dynastic iconography. Anybody want to take a stab at what's going on down here? Lower register, right back to registers again. Just like Ur-Nammu, which we'll look at next time. How about in that lower scene? I'll give you a hint. It stops right here. So this is another gentleman sort of walking. Anybody want to take a stab at what's going on here? We've seen this before. We've actually seen it in a few places. It's a seated person with here's his head, and his arm is reaching out, and there's a scaffolding here with a bowl and edge and some strings coming straight down there. We saw this on the standard of Ur. Yeah, it's a bull lyre. Yeah, so he's playing a bull lyre. Or actually, it's not so much a bull, but it's a lyre again with the head of a person on it. So again, Gudea reaching back into that sort of library of dynastic motifs and then putting them back on things people would have been familiar with. Again, right, anchoring himself into old traditions, deflecting the traditions that didn't work in the Akkadian period, and creating something new, a really hybrid system that ends up being pretty effective. And we'll see next week with the Neo-Sumerian period. There is this emphasis on king as ruler. And that's kind of a pun, right? A ruler and a ruler. But in English it works pretty well. In Sumerian it doesn't, but the same concept is applied, right? Someone who builds, someone who measures, appoints justice. We're going to see our first law codes compiled. We're going to see standardized weights and measures, not just our bevel rim bowls, but real weights and measures for fair trade, contracts that are signed with witnesses, things like that. So there is this bureaucracy that takes place in the Ur-3 period, which we'll look at next time. I just wanted to close today, again, since it's Friday, we're going to stop there, but I wanted to make you aware of something, this really cool website It's a design firm in Berlin. Whoops. Let's see if this actually, if I can get this going. It's called Artifacts Scientific Illustration Archaeological Reconstruction. You can get the English version of the web page, but it's just artifacts-berlin.de. And it's this design firm, and what they've done is they've gone back through archaeological reports and have done 3D reconstructions. And we've seen these 3D reconstructions before, that's nothing new, but what's nice is they have gone as far as to show the process in which these temples and palaces would have been made. So again, this is going back to the stone cone mosaic temple at Ur, right, during our during the Uruk period, and you can see the laying of the foundation. You can see right, those were drainage pipes that were laid in. Clean sand foundation, which is put in, and then right, the laying out of the stone foundation itself. Because again, as we discussed, you know, our walls, which are often made of mud brick, need a solid stone foundation. There's a plastered pool being made to the south, and then door jambs being put in place to support pivoting internal doors. Let's see where else this goes, right? The external areas filled up, again, with clean sand. That emphasis on purity and piety, almost like a moat, right? Keeping anything that could be impure away from the temple itself. Those foundations now in place and covered over again. And then finally, right, the walls being laid out, this time with doors so you can access them. Wooden struts, and then again I have no idea what's going on. Oh, okay. Yeah, and this is very interesting too. They go into the way that, right, we looked at these clay cones, and then in this case, right, they were stone cones, a system of brackets that were used to hold these stone cones in place. And that repeats itself over and over and over again, both inside and outside of the temple. And floors laid in and plastered over. And now our wall is built up layer by layer with those brackets at each stage. In fact, I think I'll zoom in here. You can see here. And we can see again, right during the Uruk period, like we talked about several weeks ago, the spacing of these rooms was dictated by the length of the timber that could be cut and brought in to cover them. So you're not going to get much wider than about 5 or 6 meters during this time. I think by about 10 meters you can get cedars that are about 10 meters in length. And the building of these windows up at the top. Again, roofing taking place. It's like Minecraft on steroids. It's awesome. And again, right, the use of these stone cones being fit into this bracketing system, which would